Well, welcome everyone who's able to join us via live here virtually for our December HR Council meeting. And for those that are watching the recording afterwards, we're very happy to be joined again by attorney Brendan Feheley with Kegler, Brown, Hill, and Ritter. I believe he's out of the Columbus location, but of course we have Kegler, Brown, Hill, and Ritter in Marion as well. But very happy to have him back to talk to us today about a variety of updates related to COVID-19 and employers, and he'll cover just a gambit of things that they're seeing right now, conversations that they've had for the last 9 months, and what to look forward to in the future as it relates to the role of employers and what they play in with employment law and more.
Thanks, Matt. Absolutely. Please feel free to jump in and ask me any questions that you want as we go through this. This is admittedly a ever-changing topic, both for you and for me. And so it's very hard to write and give a presentation like this because I don't know precisely what you all want to know. And it's not as easy as being able to sort of say, well, here's the law and this is how we interact with it and how we deal with it. Because this thing moves around and changes depending on what kind of industry you're in or who your employees are and that type of situation. So feel free at any time to stop and ask questions if I get to something that you'd like to ask a question about. Also, feel free to put any questions in the chat that you want. I do have some time at the end that I've left open for Q&A. If there aren't any questions, great. If there are, I will try to answer them to the best of my ability at the end, and no promises that what I'm going to tell you is necessarily right or won't change tomorrow. But I'm going on what we have as of last night. So with that, the starting point for this is sort of an idea of like, where are we? That's what people keep sort of talking to me about. Where are we? And when you think back to March 12th, that's when Ohio schools were closed for 3 weeks. And I think that's when most of Ohio sort of realized like, something's going on that's different than what we've ever seen before. And at that point, and then, 10 days later, we got the stay-at-home order. We had 247 cases in the state at that point. It's shocking to think about where we were at the time that we shut everything down. And then you think about December 12th, so 9 months later, we had 553,461 total cases, 11,252 cases alone on that day. And you can see that our hospital admits were 20 higher than the total number of cases we had on March 22nd. So in 9 months, if the question is, are we better than where we were? The answer is no, we're not. We're not better than where we were in March. We're not better than where we were in June when you saw the federal government finally step in and offer some assistance through the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which gave emergency paid sick leave and emergency FMLA and unemployment assistance. There's no metric that measures the virus that demonstrates that we're in a better position now than we are then, than we were then. So the interesting question is, well, what do we do? And what you'll see is, in some instances, our health departments are so overwhelmed that they are just throwing their hands up here and saying, we're not sure what to do. And so Marion Health Department has said they will not investigate any cases, anything until you have a positive test. So one question I get from people all the time is, I have an employee that has some symptoms. Should I call the health department? No, they won't do anything. Okay, they flat out have said they will not do anything until you have a confirmed diagnosis, which is typically lab results. So a test is what they're looking for before they will do anything. Now, what they've said is that everybody has to isolate for at least 48 hours from when their symptoms started. And they should isolate as soon as they have symptoms until they get a test result. But Marion is no longer sending out contact tracing letters. They are simply overwhelmed. They can't do it. That creates a whole host of problems for employers, because a lot of employers were counting on those letters as a pretty good indication of when to tell people not to come to work, or they were counting on them as being their sort of information point to where an employee said, oh, I have to quarantine. And most employers were saying, good, send me, oh, that's fine. Send me a copy of your letter that you have so I can put it in my files. Also, because if you're going to pay the emergency paid sick leave to them, then you get a credit against your payroll tax that you pay. And if you were to get audited, the question is, well, what documentation do I give to show that I paid it because this person had to quarantine? The answer was, until last week, give them the quarantine letter that came from the health department. Okay. Now we don't have that. So now what we want is some sort of email or written communication from the employee that says, I was called, I have to quarantine. Now the problem is that who they want to really do the contact tracing at this point is the individual who tests positive. They're saying, we want you to call your close contacts, whoever they may have been, and tell them to quarantine. So we're not going to have even a phone call in some instances with the health department to tell somebody to quarantine. We're going to have a call from their buddy who they were out at the bar with, who has now tested positive and told them to quarantine. Okay. So one of the questions I get is, well, okay, but that's not really reliable documentation. What do I do if I have to submit, if I'm trying to get credit against my payroll tax? The Treasury Department is not going to strenuously audit this. It's just not going to, they don't have the manpower to do it. They don't have the time to do it. And they recognize that most health departments are now in this situation where they simply can't do the contact tracing to the way that they would like to do it. So what I'm recommending is get something from your employee that indicates that they have a friend. Get that friend's name if you can, who tested positive, that's warranting them quarantining for 14 days. Okay. Get some information that you can try to have if down the line there's a question asked about, well, why did you give this person paid sick leave? What happened there? We want as much information as you can possibly have, but also recognize that there's some information we're just not going to get now. It's just not going to happen. So we have to live in reality and say, okay, let's figure out what we can get. Okay. Now, what's supposed to happen is individuals are supposed to reach out to their close contacts and ask them to quarantine. So the question that comes up is, well, do they have to? No, they don't have to. There is not the same legal requirement that comes from a health department order that indicates that they have to, that you are required to quarantine. Okay. So one of the questions is from employers, well, what do we do? They don't have to quarantine. Well, I think with the spread the way it is with the virus, I think you want them to quarantine. You want anybody who is suspected to have been in close contact with someone who tested positive, you don't want them coming to work. Okay. The stories of the spread of this thing are just too fast, and it is just too difficult to try and maintain it, especially in a medium to large employer. It is really just impossible almost to try and keep track of where folks are. And you can put in all the social distancing measures you want, but shockingly, two people go to the microwave at the same time and they're standing next to each other waiting on food, and who knows how long that ends up taking. And people line up to clock in, clock out. There's all sorts of things that you can try to stop, but it's human nature. So we're still fighting that. And so I think anytime somebody calls you and says, I'm supposed to quarantine because my friend who I was with last weekend tested positive, my family tested positive, I think you want to support that because I think the last thing you want is an outbreak in your workplace. And we'll get into further reasons. Go ahead, Katrina.
I'm sorry, and I hate to interrupt, but I just want to ask a question real quick. So let's just say somebody that did know somebody that was positive, and they may have had close contact more than the 15 minutes. They went to go get tested and it came negative, but they did have that close contact. Now, we want to tell them, you're saying to go ahead and stay home, but is that paid under that CARES Act?
Yes, I mean, so it can still be paid based on, and I'm going to go there in just a second, but there's different now recommendations for the quarantine period. And the quarantine period, the CARES Act does not tie to whether or not you test positive or negative. In fact, the CARES Act considers the fact that you may not ever get tested, that you may be told to quarantine and simply not get a test done. And so they are paying based on your need to quarantine because of that close contact, not based on whether or not you have a positive test or not.
And it does not have to come from a doctor. So me telling this person yes because you've had close contact.
So I think yes. I mean, at this point, I don't think it has to come from a doctor because you're not going to get it from a doctor. Now, you could have the employee contact their doctor. I'm recommending to people that if an employee asks you what to do, the first thing ought to be contact a medical provider.
Yes.
And the reason for that is relatively simple. We don't know the underlying conditions of all of our employees, and frankly, we don't want to know them. Okay? If we know them, we have to deal with them from the Americans with Disabilities Act, and anybody who's heard me speak before has heard me tell you that when it comes to the Americans with Disabilities Act, the less you know, the better you are. Okay? So we don't want to know whether or not they have high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, any of the things that could be underlying conditions that could make them getting sick with this much worse than it might be for other folks. So my advice is if you get a call from your friend that says, hey, I tested positive, we were in close contact, the first thing you do is call your medical provider and say, what do I do? And if they say, go ahead.
This person did, and like I said, I think, could be the test was done too soon, or maybe she was negative, but it was negative, and then I'm like, she's wanting to know, they didn't isolate her, so now I'm like, does she come back to work, or does she isolate?
So isolation and quarantine are different. Isolation means you're not to be around anyone, even in your own family. Quarantine means you're in your house, but you're not recommended to go to work. And so I think employers are free to do whatever they want within the CDC guidelines. And the CDC guidelines say you can quarantine somebody for up to 14 days when they're a close contact. So based on the information you have, I think you're fine to go ahead and say, we want you to stay out. Now, the big thing to remember is you're not going to get a quarantine letter. Okay? You're simply not going to get it. So I think as a group, you all want to be working with your leadership in all of your facilities and saying, we're not getting these quarantine letters anymore. What do we want to do? How do we want to handle these situations? Exactly like Katrina mentioned that she had, because you're going to have those. And so what you want is a universal message from your managers out to the employees. What you don't want is one manager saying, oh no, it's fine, come on into work, and somebody else saying, stay home. Okay? You want this to be universal. You may even want to create a temporary policy that indicates that, hey, look, we're not going to get a quarantine letter. But a couple things of importance. Number one, if you get called by one of your friends and told that they tested positive and you were in close contact, you need to tell us so that we know, right? Because we have to also try to identify the work area where you might have been or anything else that might have gone on, okay? You also should, if you're telling people you should stay away from work, then you should stay away from work. But the starting point for all of this is you've got to call us and tell us, because we're otherwise not going to find out. Okay. Now, the big negative here is if an employee doesn't want to tell you, they just want to come to work. I don't know that we would ever know until they're actually sick, which seems to me to be the absolute worst thing you would want to happen in the midst of a pandemic, is that employers don't know whether or not people are sick or potentially exposed or not. But that's where we are. So one recommendation for everybody is talk with your management groups, figure out how we're handling the fact that these letters aren't coming out. Both the individuals aren't going to get them and we're not going to get them. Okay. Now, the Ohio Department of Health, and this goes to Katrina's question, has released basically 3 options for you. And they're based on different science. The science is obviously unclear as this thing's moving for purposes of how long people need to quarantine and what to do. But this chart's pretty helpful from the Ohio Department of Health. So they're still saying the optimal thing to do is 14 days. Okay. And they're saying especially if you're in a moderate or high risk work environment. And those ones are ones that frequently come in contact with the public. If you're in an accounting firm, for example, you have your own office, you're walking in, you're going to your office, you're staying in your office, etc. You're lower risk. Maybe then you start looking at one of these reduced durations here. But I think all of you need to be thinking about your workplace. How much interaction do people actually have with one another? If somebody had symptoms, what's the likelihood that it might spread to somebody else in the workplace because of their natural way that they have to work together? You know, my clients that have fast food restaurants, I'm telling them you're high risk. Those kitchens just aren't big enough for people to stay away from each other as much as you want to try to do it. It doesn't happen. You're also interacting with the public regularly and routinely through the course of your day. So those folks, you want to lean toward maybe staying more on the optimal, or at least the reduced duration, as opposed to going to the secondary reduced duration. Now, the big thing about the reduced duration is it's still saying to self-monitor for 14 days. And so that means simply watching for symptoms. They want you to do it twice a day, still paying attention to those things. And they're recommending you get tested, but they're recommending you get tested on day 8 or later, because what they're indicating is that you may get tested too early and it may show up as essentially a false negative. And then when you test, if you get tested day 8 or later, if you're negative at that point, you most likely were not exposed by that thing that warranted you quarantining. The second reduced duration is 7 days, but that assumes a negative test day 5 or later. And so going back to Katrina's question, I think in that instance, if somebody came and said, I have a negative test, the question would be, okay, when did the exposure allegedly happen? When was your test? If your test was inside of 5 days, it doesn't count. For the purposes of the Ohio Department of Health, it doesn't count. So this is, again, a good thing. You may want to talk with your leadership group about how you're going to handle things and then communicate these rules out to employees. Certainly, if you are using one of the reduced durations, the 10 days or the 7 days, what I would recommend in that instance is make sure that you're telling employees that you want them to get tested. If you're doing the 10-day, you want them to get tested day 8, so that at least we know, hopefully we get those results back before 10 days. If we don't, we probably get them back day 11 or day 12. And if they're positive, we can pull the person right back out. Okay. And certainly if you're going to go the secondary reduced duration, the 7 days, you want that, you have to get that negative test. And I think you've got to get that negative test result. Otherwise, you're really in a risk where you may have more employees get infected, in which case, it gets harder and harder to staff your workforce. So that chart is available through the Ohio Department of Health. Also, Matt's going to make my slides available after this, so you'll be able to pull it from there. You are absolutely free to steal it. No pride of authorship to it, but you can pull it from there and talk with your leadership group about sort of the next steps. So, and also the information that was on the prior slide from Marion County Public Health Department is available on their website. I pulled that yesterday, so that stuff is up to date. So you can go there, and if you want to start the conversation among your management group, bring those 2 sheets of paper in and say, let's sit down and talk about how we're going to handle these situations. So now we get into the next portion of this, which is what on earth is an employer to do with the current information where we are. Okay, there is no quarantine letter, so you don't have a legal obligation to keep people away from work. As I said, I would recommend doing it, but you don't have an obligation to do so. One of the things that I think will be coming soon, I don't know exactly the cost, is the FDA has approved an at-home COVID-19 test. Okay, I think this might be very useful, but it really depends on how much it costs and whether or not people can freely get it, and what the expenses are associated with it. It's something to pay attention to, especially if you're going to use one of those reduced duration time periods that are asking for, a negative test result before bringing somebody back into work. I think if it's relatively cost effective, then that's something employers can consider reimbursing employees for the cost of one if they have to quarantine if they're trying to bring them back sooner than the 14-day period of time. Okay. Now I will tell you that for those of you that have employees that come out of, for example, Delaware and work up in Marion, Delaware is entirely different. They're saying it's a 14-day quarantine, and if it's someone in your family, it's an additional 14 days after that person's 14 days, which puts you out a month. Now, that is assuming that you're not self-isolating from your family in the event of a positive test. And in that instance, I think if you could show that the person was self-isolated, the stories are the person's going to the basement and they're not around their family members. They're living down in the basement for a while. In that instance, I think you can start the 14 days from sort of the last time that you were around that person. But you've got to also pay attention to where your employees are coming from, because you're not always going to, they're not all necessarily going to come from Marion. They're going to be coming to you with different rules that they're getting, different letters that they're getting. And so the question is, what do you do? I think most employers ought to be paying attention to the health department where that employee lives. You don't want to be getting the employees in trouble with their health departments because you're telling them not to pay attention to the rules. But if they're coming out of a place that isn't giving letters and isn't really telling you what you have to do, then it's kind of your call. So the worst case example is the one that we're dealing with here, which is that you have an employee who goes out drinking with a friend. 4 days later, the friend, has some symptoms, tells some person that there's day 5, they test positive, and tell your employee. I mean, this is the incident, the situation where you may not actually know, you may never find this out. So this is where I think the most important thing you can do right now is communicate to your employees the need to tell you in the event they are told by someone that they need to quarantine. Okay. Previously, what we were saying is when the letter comes, you do what the letter says, but if an employee calls you, you keep them out. The same thing still applies, but now it's even more important that your employees reach out to you anytime they are told to quarantine. Now, the question is, if you don't find out, now what do we do, right? If you don't find out, you are able to discipline an employee if you have a policy that says they're supposed to notify you. It's no different when any other time they're supposed to notify you and they don't. For example, if they're supposed to notify you before calling off work and they don't, the same rules apply here. So if your policy is, if you are told to quarantine and you don't tell us, you will be disciplined. You can absolutely discipline an employee for that. As long as you're doing it universally across the board, like every other disciplinary policy we talk about, you have every right to do that. Now, the question is whether or not you want to take on that role. And the problem is that a lot of times people don't know exactly where they got it from. So we can't say for certain that, well, you got it from your friend that you were out with and you didn't quarantine. So if you discipline them, you're disciplining them not for getting it. You're disciplining them for the fact that they were told to quarantine and they didn't do it. Okay. Now, interestingly, the way these discussions are going from clients, what they're telling me is people aren't saying, oh, you need to quarantine because I got COVID. They're saying, I got COVID, and that's it. And they're leaving it up to your employee to try to determine whether or not that employee was a close contact to the person who got COVID. So if they call you and say, well, I got a call from my friend and I saw him last weekend and they said they're tested positive and I don't know if I should quarantine. And the questions you need to be asking them are, were you around them for 15 minutes? Did you not have your mask on? Tell me about your interaction with that person so we can try to decide whether or not that would be a close contact and whether or not that person ought to quarantine. You do it the same way that you were doing contact tracing. And so that's what I'm recommending everybody ought to do. And we'll get to contact tracing in just a second. Everything is not bad, though. There is some good news. The governor did sign House Bill 606. It does provide protection for businesses from suits alleging harm caused by COVID-19. So it provides protection for an employee suing you claiming they got COVID-19 from the workplace, a customer suing you claiming they got COVID-19 from the workplace. But it does have a little bit of an exception to it, and that exception is that it does not provide, the suit can go forward, it does not provide protection if the behavior was reckless. So the question now is, what is reckless behavior? Well, I think if we go back to the Ohio Department of Health, that's where following one of those three things that they lay out is going to be a pretty good protection for you. Okay, it's hard to argue that you acted recklessly if you're following the rules from the Department of Health, one of the three. Now, are there going to be claims that, well, it was reckless for an employer to choose reduced duration too, as opposed to taking the 14-day quarantine? Sure. Do I think those are going to be successful? Probably not. But I also think it goes back to paying attention to your workplace. If you're a hospital, taking reduced duration too might not be the best idea. If you're able to manage it with one of the longer quarantines, because obviously in a hospital, you're around people who have the virus, you're more susceptible for your employees to pick it up. So I think as long as you follow the Department of Health rules, you're probably okay. I think as long as you continue to do contact tracing, you continue to do the things that you've been doing, and you keep in all the social distancing and the other stuff that you have in your workplaces, you're probably okay. But that's where, you know, there is no sort of legal definition of the word reckless. It depends on the circumstances, right? What I think the big trigger for you all is you have to do something. You cannot look at this House bill and say, okay, we've got immunity, we're not going to be sued, forget it. Everybody go back to life before March 12th, and we're going to start, you know, hanging out next to each other. We're going to reopen the lunchroom. Everybody can sit near one another, you know, all of that stuff. You can't do that. Okay. That is going to be deemed to be reckless behavior. So I think what we need to do is just make sure we're keeping those things in place. So that means contact tracing. I think contact tracing is going to be one of the most important ways to prove that you weren't reckless if you get one of these lawsuits. So everybody ought to do it. If you weren't doing it because you were counting on the health department to do it, as I indicated earlier, you can't do that anymore because they're not doing it. So you need to do it. And that means talking with your employees as quickly as you can about who were you around, that you were inside of 6 feet for 15 minutes or more. Remember, the definition's changing, but the current definition is it's 15 minutes cumulatively across the entire day. Originally, it was 15 minutes or more in one isolated interaction. Now it's 15 minutes or more across the entire day. So that presumably would be more people than it was previously. How you ought to do it is you try to get a hold of that person. You go back 48 hours from when their symptoms onset. So if they called you on Wednesday, said I got a fever, I'm not feeling good, you go back to Monday. Okay, it's 48 hours from when the symptoms onset. So most likely, unless you're really lucky and they call you on a Monday, most likely they were at work during some of that 48-hour period that we want to be checking for. You know, if employees don't necessarily know, sorry about that. You know, if our employees don't comply, you know, then you've got to do the best you can. And what you got to do in that instance really is look at your workplace and try to figure out, okay, in the course of that person's day, what should we do? Now, one of the things that I'm advising a lot of employers to do, because we get into this question of the telephone game at work, right? And we get into this question of, well, but Sally works next to John, and Sally knows that John's now hadn't been at work for 2 weeks, and so she knows that he got COVID, and she's mad because we didn't tell her that he got it. And so how do we handle that? Because the telephone game happens, and frankly, we don't often have employees miss 2 weeks of work, even for vacation. So if they're out 2 weeks in the midst of a global pandemic, it's not hard for the other employees to figure out why they're not there. They either had to quarantine or they got it. It's one of those two things. So what a lot of employers are doing, and what I'm advising is a good practice to do, is to have 2 letters. 1 letter that goes out to people that are close contact that says, hey, contact your health provider. You're out. You're in quarantine. You were a close contact. And another one that says, we did have a positive test, either in the facility, in your department, on your shift, however it is that you want to break those things down. We did have a positive test, but we don't believe that you were a close contact, and so we don't believe you have to do anything. Now, do not give out the information as to who it is that had the positive test. Number one, the employees will figure it out because it's a person who doesn't come for the next 2 weeks. But second of all, we don't need to disclose that information. Okay, and most of the letters that I recommend, or the ones that I write for people, say, because we also respect employees' privacy, we're not giving you information about who did it unless we absolutely have to. Okay, but we're telling people, if you feel that you need to contact your health provider because we had a positive test in the facility, go ahead and do it. Okay, because based on whatever that person's other medical conditions may be, their health provider may say, go get tested. Just go get tested. But you want to provide them some information. So if we had an employee test positive, but they don't work in your department, and so we don't believe that you were a close contact to them, that's helpful because that's information that employee can pass along to their medical provider and determine what to do next. Absolutely. If they aren't on the same shift, we want to tell them. If somebody who wasn't even on your shift, we don't think you had a close contact with them. That's, again, information somebody can pass along to their medical provider and try to help them determine what to do next. Because the answer to that really does depend on a whole bunch of information that you don't have, which is who they live with. I mean, if they live with somebody who's high risk, their doctor may tell them to go get tested earlier than somebody else would get tested. If they have a family member that they see who's in assisted living or some sort, they're going to tell them different things than if they don't. You don't have all of that information. So the more you can communicate with your employees, the better informed they can be about what they need to do in their individual situations. Now, are we only worried about coworkers? Well, we were until the health department decided they're not going to tell people anymore whether or not they need to quarantine. So I think if an employee calls you and says, I tested positive, what do I do? You want to reiterate what Marion's Department of Health is telling them to do. Contact your friends, tell those people, make sure those people quarantine. Okay. You want to try to help them do what they need to do here. Now, should you call people that are not employees of yours? No, don't do that. Don't take your time doing all of the health department's job for them. Okay. But you should make sure that you're telling the employee the proper things that they ought to tell folks what to do. And again, this is where some sort of a temporary policy that you create in light of the new circumstances we're living in might be helpful, because it might be a situation where you can email them, hey, listen, here's the quarantine rules. Here's what you're supposed to do. Make sure you contact these folks. Make sure if your symptoms get worse or you have any trouble breathing, contact your health provider immediately. So the good news is we are doing a lot better on the therapeutic front. We are doing better at curing people. The biggest problem that I'm hearing about from employers where folks are really still struggling with this is when they don't go in quick enough. They don't go get to a medical provider quick enough. They don't go into the hospital quick enough. And at that point, the hospitals are running out of options with how they can treat people. So, if people are asking us questions because they don't know who else to ask, if they don't feel well, go to the hospital. Go to the hospital or contact your doctor as quickly as you can. So what are your legal obligations in the world of COVID-19? As we said, House Bill 606 gives you some protections. There are some things you still have to pay attention to. We still have a curfew, okay? There are exceptions to the curfew, which include going to and coming back from work, okay? But, the question is, do you really want to keep your hours, especially if you're in kind of a retail setting, do you want to keep your hours such that if anybody were to come in, they're violating curfew to do it, right? So the folks that tend to, as we get closer to the holidays, extend hours on Christmas Eve, on things like that, be careful about that with regard to the curfew. You don't want to be setting up a situation where anybody who comes in, any customer who comes in, is technically violating the curfew potentially. Then we got the face masks. And what do we do when employees claim that they can't wear face masks? Well, you need to look at the governor's most recent order. His most recent order says that employees who can't wear a face mask are allowed to wear a face shield. Okay. It does not say they're not allowed, that they don't wear a mask. It says they're not allowed to wear a face shield, that they can wear a face shield. Now, you'll have customers who come to you and say, I can't wear a mask. My response to that is the governor's order says, offer them something else. Offer them curbside pickup. You can offer them a different time to come in that may be less busy. You can offer them something, but they're not saying that what you ought to do is just let them come in and shop. Okay, that's not what the governor wants you to do. Now, are you going to get in trouble? Probably not. I would like to have some documentation on that point. I will tell you that much like I've seen some really creative employee sick notes from fake doctor's offices, there are fake notes out there now saying people can't wear a mask due to conditions, and you can just pull them up off the internet. I've had clients who have gotten them, and they look fake, and they've gotten them from their employees and from customers. What I've said is, one thing you could do is instruct your managers, if somebody comes with one of those, well, we're going to contact that office real quick and see if, just verify that you're a patient from there. In the instance of it being fake, I mean, usually that person just turns and leaves at that point. They're not going to go down that path with you all the way, but recognize that those fake things are out there. Because frankly, we don't know. None of us are scientists. And so there are people who believe that, who understand and believe that the masks are helpful. There are other people who don't believe they're helpful and who believe that they're an infringement on their liberties. Both sides of that debate are out there. I know from my clients in Marion that both sides of that debate are active in Marion. There are folks on both sides of that fence. I'm not going to punish anybody for whichever side of the fence you're on. I'm just telling you what the governor is saying is that it's not okay to simply say, well, you told me you can't wear this, and so now you don't have to. The emergency paid sick leave. There are 6 qualifying reasons for that. You should know them probably by now because we're into December. You do have to comply with that. And the maximum is 80 hours. Now, one question I get asked a lot is it a one-time thing? It's not a one-time thing. It is up to 80 hours. So if somebody has to quarantine, but they only, they quarantine for a period of 10 days, of which there is 2 weekends in there, they won't have used all of their 80 hours. Okay. So in that instance, they have additional time. The good part about that is that they have it because frankly, people are having to quarantine more than one time. We're not in a world where one quarantine is all you have. A lot of people are having to do it multiple times. Now, it expires on December 31st. Okay. As of right now, it is not in the new stimulus bill extending that emergency paid sick leave. Is not in there. I will give you my opinion on that, which is that it's ludicrous that it's not in there, because health departments aren't issuing quarantine orders if people aren't going to get paid to be out of work when they have to quarantine for this. They're not going to tell you. Okay. And the one thing we know for sure about almost every American is that they either want money in December right up to Christmas so they can spend it on Christmas and the holidays, or they spend too much money on Christmas and the holidays and they have to work in January to make sure they pay off everything that they bought in December. We all do that. And especially in 2020, when frankly, for most of us, the year sucks. So you're looking at something positive, and Christmas and Hanukkah and all the holidays are exciting for people. So in January, if all of a sudden I have to quarantine and I'm not going to get paid, am I calling you and telling you so I can miss 2 weeks of work and not get paid? No. And I know that your employees are generally great people. But if you believe that they're going to use their vacation time to quarantine in January and they don't have that earmarked to use at some other time in the year, then I've got some real estate in Alabama I'd like to talk to you about, right? Because it's just not going to happen. So the problem that employers face is on January 1st, I don't know how we keep this thing at bay. And in Ohio, the weather is absolutely going to be worse in January and February than it is right now. And as I was telling Matt, I knew it was going to snow today because every time I'm supposed to do something in Marion, it snows, right? And so today we did it virtually, which is great. As my kids tell me all the time, all this virtual stuff means is we'll never have a snow day again because all the teachers now know how to just move everything to virtual again. And I'm thinking, well, that probably is the same for me too. But, so this is not going to extend. So you're done dealing with it administratively as of December 31st. Now, the president-elect has indicated that he is in favor of extending this. And so it's possible that it doesn't show up in this stimulus bill and we go through a really weird period of time for a couple weeks or a month where it's not in place. And then in January, it comes back and it extends back again. Same applies to the EFMLA. Now, this one, honestly, is even worse than it isn't extended because I don't know any schools that are going all in back in January. So you still have kids that are either remote learning entirely or they're part-time remote learning through the hybrid schedule. You're still going to have employees who can't come to work because they have to be at home with the kids. Now they're not going to be paid to do that. So I don't know what we do for them. I am not recommending that you pay them for 10 weeks of leave out of your own pocket because most employers can't do that. They don't have the economic wherewithal to do that for all their employees. Now, one other thing on the EFMLA that I want to mention because I get to be the Grinch at Christmas time. The EFMLA does not apply to winter break. Okay, so as soon as the schools are done, so for my kids, it's Friday, until they're back in school, you don't give EFMLA because the EFMLA only applies when the school or daycare is closed due to COVID-19. It is not closed due to COVID-19 for winter break. Okay, so for most of you, if not Friday, Monday is probably the last day that you have EFMLA to deal with. That's at 2/3 pay, at least until we find out if it's expanded or not. And if it is expanded, we will be certain to notify people. You'll see a bunch of stuff go around about that if that gets expanded. We just don't know yet. Okay, your other legal requirements are OSHA, everybody's favorite. OSHA's frequently violated citations relating to COVID-19 are mostly around written respiratory protection programs, meaning if you are requiring people to wear something more than a cloth face mask, if you're requiring them to wear N95s or something, you're supposed to have a program, a written OSHA program on that point. They want to see some documentation from you that you're doing the steps you're taking to keep your workplace safe from COVID-19. And that includes things like social distancing, one-way walkways, plexiglass up. They want to see that stuff in writing somewhere so that if they get a complaint, they can ask you, what steps have you taken? And you have a document to give them. Fatalities. OSHA's position is if there's a fatality within 30 days of the last day that someone works due to COVID-19, you should report it. Now, the question is, did they get COVID-19 from work? You can't answer that question. No one can answer that question. I think your best advice is if they got quarantined because of somebody at work who they were around, and then they tested positive, and then they got sick and unfortunately died, that would be one I would report. Where there is evidence that suggests that the workplace had something to do with them being out, either that's what caused them to quarantine, or they say, oh, I got it because I was working right next to, if you have a department where 4 people have it, and they're one of those 4 people, I wouldn't be trying to argue to OSHA that, hey, it didn't happen at work. If you report it, it's not the same as reporting what we would call a normal fatality, so to speak. They're just going to come out and check to make sure that you're doing the 6-foot social distancing. They're just going to make sure that you're taking the necessary precautions. They're trying to make sure the same as House Bill 606, that you're not reckless with regard to this thing. As long as you're taking the precautions, OSHA recognizes that unfortunately some individuals are not surviving this virus. So they're just looking to make sure that you're taking the appropriate steps as best as you can. The general duty clause says that you have an obligation to keep all of your employees safe. That is where I think there's some friction between what OSHA wants and what sort of the Ohio Department of Health is saying about those reduced duration quarantine situations. I think if you're a high risk organization and you're not operating on the 14 days, you could see an OSHA inspector cite you for a general duty violation. So, I think you've got to consider all of that when you're trying to decide how to manage these situations. But in the past, the citations that they were giving on the general duty clause were employers that honestly were doing nothing. I mean, they were in situations where they weren't requiring masks. There's a ton of evidence out there that they were just not doing the things they were supposed to do. I think there was one that was given to a restaurant that didn't space the tables out they were just ignoring it. I mean, they just said, I'm not going to deal with it. And OSHA stepped in. Now, I would tell you that the President-elect Biden has also indicated that he's going to try to direct more resources to OSHA to help deal with COVID-19. And so you may see more inspections around this, more resources, a more aggressive response to complaints that they get related to COVID-19 in the new administration. The current administration has sort of told them to lay off, consistent with the overall message that the administration is giving, which is go back to living. Now, record keeping, this is where you get into that question again of, well, should I record something that happened at work and should I record an exposure that happened at work? The answer is, if your evidence suggests from an investigation that it most likely happened at work, that you'd want to record on your OSHA 300 log. One example that I advised somebody on was two people that the investigation showed that they had lockers near one another. They went back in and they were talking without masks with lockers on, and the conversation took more than 20 minutes. And the one person then tested positive. Then when the second person tested positive, we in that one recommended recording that, because the evidence seemed to suggest that it was more likely than not that the illness, the exposure happened at work, given those facts. So I think you're looking at all the facts. I think it's just like any other OSHA 300 recording that you do. If you have evidence that suggests that it may not have come out of work, it may not have arisen out of work, then you don't record it. You also have the ability to strike through a recording. So if you record one and then you find out later that, well, we thought it might have happened because somebody in the department, but it turns out that the person happens to live with, the person they live with got COVID a day before they got it. Okay, maybe you can go back and strike through that one because your investigation indicates that it may not have actually come from work. So then the great question, the most current question that I'm getting is the COVID vaccine. And, it's here. And so therefore, look, we've got some light at the end of the tunnel. And so where are we? Most of you probably know, unless you live under a rock, the Pfizer vaccine has been approved. The first people in Ohio received the vaccine. The frontline workers are getting that. The Moderna vaccine came out yesterday. The FDA said it was highly effective, which gets it over its next hurdle. It still has to be granted emergency use authorization, which is likely to come here in the near future. And then that vaccine will start to be given to individuals. The Oxford vaccine is moving toward approval. That's the Oxford AstraZeneca one that hit some hurdles. That one is probably less likely to be here in a hurry. What I've read about that is that large portions of that are going to be used in Europe and in other countries who don't have as much access to the Moderna or Pfizer one, because the U.S. has swallowed up as much as they can of that. Johnson & Johnson is expecting results in January for theirs. What's interesting about theirs is they have two studies going on. One that is a one-dose vaccine and one that is a 2-dose vaccine. Obviously, if they're successful in a 1-dose vaccine, that may improve how quickly sort of we can start to return to normal, because the others, the Moderna and the Pfizer, require 2 vaccinations about 3 weeks to a month apart. And so even though folks are getting it, you've got another month time in there. I don't have any great information for you on when the general public's going to be able to get a vaccine. I keep hearing the summer. I keep hearing late spring, or, at the absolute earliest, and more likely the summer. I think what I would advise anybody in the HR field is just keep paying attention to when those deadlines are that are coming out and when you're seeing people start to get it. And then you'll start to see some modifications in the various health orders and things like that. Now, the $64,000 question: can you require your employees to take the vaccine? Yes, you can. Okay, you are legally allowed to do that. All of them? No. But you can have a general rule that you want employees to do it. For example, most hospitals require all employees to get the flu shot. They have required it for years. But the issue here is if an individual comes forward with medical documentation indicating that they cannot get the vaccine, either because their immune system, certain folks, what the vaccine does is it replicates the virus so that your body reacts to it as though you are sick. And so people are reporting that when they get the vaccine, they get a fever, they're sick for 24 hours. That's what the vaccine's supposed to do. And it's triggering your body's response so that if you do get COVID-19, your body will react to it. It'll keep your body able to fight it off. But also what it really does is make sure that you don't get it severely, okay, by teaching your body how to react to it. The problem is people with certain problems in their immune system may not be able to get the vaccine because it may create a problem for them that their body can't handle. We don't know yet who those people are, but if somebody comes forward and says, I have medical documentation from a doctor, I can't get the vaccine, you can't require them to do it. Okay, that's where it'd be an ADA reasonable accommodation question about whether or not that work rule would apply to them. And I think the advice would be that it doesn't. I think the relevance of that goes to the question of whether or not you should require all your employees to do it. Obviously, the more people that get vaccinated, the better it is for those who can't get vaccinated. So the question everyone's saying is, well, tell us what to do. I'm smart enough to not tell you what to do when it comes to that. What I am going to tell you to do is talk with the people in your community. Talk with the other, you guys as a council, talk to each other about what you're doing, about what your workplaces are doing. It's going to be a little bit like masks were in the beginning. If everyone decides that we're going to require the employees to get it when it becomes readily available, then employees are going to complain about it. But then if anywhere else they try to go and all their friends tell them, yeah, my employer made me do it too, then eventually they're going to be quiet about it. I mean, that's the way it's going to go. I can tell you that the schools are going to require it. The schools are absolutely going to be requiring kids to get vaccines. I'm almost certain of it. They require it for so many other vaccinations in the schools. I cannot imagine that they're not going to do it now. And the folks that I know in various school leadership have told me that that's their expectation, is that they are going to be doing that. You're going to see things. You're going to see the CDC come out and tell you that they recommend that everybody get it. You're going to get some help in whatever position you take from some entities and agencies that are saying, we recommend that everybody do this. So you don't have to. I don't know whether or not you should or not, but I think the answer to that may in part depend on what everybody else is doing around you, so that when employees are talking to other people, what is the message they're hearing from elsewhere? And so this is one where I would tell all employers, collaborate together, work together, figure out what you're all doing, because it's going to make life easier for all of you if you all take a similar approach, whether or not it's strongly recommending it, requiring it, however you're going to approach it. Last major topic to cover, the federal stimulus. There will be an extension of unemployment benefits, but they did hear the backlash from all the employers that we got previously, where they said you can't give people more money so that they get paid more not to work. Okay. they're not going to do that. The Republicans went ballistic the last time when they put the math together. I don't know exactly who was advising them, because I can tell you that immediately when it came out, I sat down and did the math really quickly in my head and was like, wait a second, people are going to get paid a lot more money to not work than they're getting to work. I think that the extension of the additional benefits now going to range right around $300. Or I've also heard that there's discussions that it's going to be some portion so that it does not exceed a certain portion of what people made before. So that maybe it gets up to 75, 85% of what people made before, but it's not going to create a situation where it goes over 100% of what people made before, except for potentially for a very, very small group of people. But I think the highest you're probably going to see is 300. There is agreement, I believe, on some small business aid. It's essentially the CARES Act and FFCRA Light, which essentially means that in order to get it, a business would have to show that they had something like a 2/3 drop in revenue over a sustained period of time while the virus was going on and continuing. So it's going to be harder to get, but it is going to be out there for those entities that have really been devastated by this. I think really you're looking at kind of restaurants, bars, primarily are the ones that are gonna have that. You're gonna have some entities, you know, live event production companies, things like that, that have entirely had to shutter because of this. They're going to be eligible for it, but it's going to be much more targeted, I believe, than the last one was. The holdup appears to be about two issues. One, the Democrats want money for government. Governments have had to hire additional people to do contact tracing. They had to buy PPE. They had to do things like that. There are governments that are struggling, and the Democrats want some money for them. The Republicans say that the state governors waste their money and that they shouldn't give them any more of it. This is really a New York issue. This is a New York issue that is taking over the negotiations, because the governor of New York has come out and said they're going to have to lay off people soon because they're running out of money because of all the things they had to buy. Now, there are other governors that need it as well, but New York has been out front asking for this for a long time. And this is purely a political issue, that there are a lot of people who don't like the governor of New York. And so there's some pretty strong pushback to it. The Democrats' pushback is on liability protections for businesses. Federal law that would be similar to House Bill 606 that would provide some liability protection. What you see if you look around the country is the Republican governors and the Republican legislatures are the ones that got things like House Bill 606 passed for businesses. It did not pass in Democratic legislators because they want their governors, they want their employers to take this seriously, to put in all of the precautions. They don't want them saying, well, I have protection, so now I'm going to go back to normal. So, you know, that's the holdup. There has been some discussion, shockingly, of the two sides deciding to just drop the issues that are holdups, because there is a widespread understanding that this probably will not be the last stimulus package that we get. This stimulus package does not have direct payments to individuals. That is not a part of it as of right now. So that one, we may see more of that in January. It's not the end, I don't think, because I think honestly things are going to get a little bit worse before they get better here as we head toward in January, February, and the weather gets worse, and we have the problems we have at the health departments that we have now. So I do think to keep paying attention. I mentioned to Matt, we have at our office a COVID-19 sort of landing spot on our website that has all the articles that we have put out on this, and they come from all the different areas. Obviously, a lot are from the employment area, but they come from all of our different areas. So I will send that link to Matt. He'll send it out to you guys. I guarantee you, when this stimulus package passes, we will put something out on that. And then as one comes in the future, we'll put something out on that. And we'll continue to update orders and things that we see in Ohio. You know, I've got a couple associates that work with me, and we're pretty much paying attention to every day this stuff and trying to get things out as quick as they happen. So that is all that I have. I'm happy to answer any questions anybody wants at this point. My final thoughts are, my best advice for you all is to pay attention to your business, look and see what your risk of exposure is, and try your best to step in where you can and really communicate with your employees. It's almost over communication at this point is good, because everything you don't communicate about, the employees will try to figure out themselves. And so the more that you can get out and communicate, hey, this is what we're doing, absolutely, in light of the Marion Health Department's announcements about contact, I mean, that's absolutely an opportunity to step out and say, this is what we need you to do. This is what we expect of you. Set the expectations, because people won't follow them if you don't set them. Survival until when? You're still surviving. You're doing the best you can. I think you're looking at the summertime, although I do think things are going to get better in probably the spring when the weather turns a little bit, because people are going to be outside a little more. They're going to be able to stay apart from each other a little more. We were doing much better with this in the summertime when people could be outside a little more. So we're hopeful that in the spring you'll start to see vaccinations among people, coupled with warmer weather. So I'm really looking at kind of 60 to 75 days as sort of the worst part of this, and then we'll be headed out the other side. The other thing that we don't know what's going to happen, but pay attention to it, is you might start to see people, your higher risk folks, when they start to be able to get vaccinated of all ages, that may free up that may give you some more freedoms, because we have less people that are likely to die or need severe hospital intervention, which then opens our hospital resources back up again for folks that need it. So it is a balancing act that's going on. I think we're definitely looking at 75 days, though, that are going to be difficult. And then watch January, because to tell you that it's night and day between the president and the president-elect is an understatement. The president-elect campaigned since March on this virus, about the handling of this virus and how he believes the virus ought to be handled. Absolutely expect that you are going to see immediately him do whatever he can do by executive order. There have been talks about executive order face mask requirements. I wouldn't be shocked to see that. There's going to be money when he can get it, as quickly as he can get it. You're going to see him do whatever he can do. A lot of it's going to depend in part on what happens in Georgia in January. If the Democrats get the Senate, then you're going to start to see you may see some significant changes. If not, it may be a little harder for things to get done. But understand that, pay attention to January, because January, early February, I think, is when you're going to start to see, some major changes. And now I am done. So any questions, fire away. I know I used up most of my hour, so Matt, jump in.
Brendan, again, thank you so much for all this information. You always do an amazing job, and to cover all these topics in a short amount of time, did it excellent with that for sure. Chats, I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but if anybody has any last minute questions here, feel free to fire them off. Seeing none, of course, I will share all this information that Brendan mentioned during the presentation with all of HR Council, the slides from this, the recording of this, and then the COVID toolkit information they have on their website will also be shared as well afterwards. But gosh, I guess with that, we will see all of y'all in the next year, and get through all this together, and wish everyone a very safe and happy holidays. Brendan, thank you again.
Yep.
And,
thanks, everybody. Hopefully,
Thanks,
hopefully next time I'll be able to come back up to Marion. So I'll be able to. I miss my trips up there, so I'm hoping that soon I'll be able to come back and see you all in person.
We'll make sure it snows then too.
Yes, you will. Thanks, man. See ya.
Thanks all. Bye.